It was just this Alice in Wonderland moment where we got these documents. We didn't want anybody to see this stuff. So we had them set up a room, and only the three of us have access to the room. Fred Trump's estate tax return is in the building right now. It's incredible that we have it, and that opened a door to understanding a huge transfer of wealth that happened and gave us so much more information to be able to understand the tax games that were played. And then once you sort of pull the string, the whole thing unraveled.
That was a clip from Showtime's latest documentary, which aired last night, The Family Business, Trump and Taxes. It gives a behind-the-scenes look at extensive reporting done by the New York Times over the past year. The piece, published not even a week ago, exposed Donald Trump's alleged past of tax fraud and money laundering. A reminder of what we learned from that investigation. Quote, Mr. Trump received the equivalent today of at least $413 million from his father's real estate empire, starting when he was a toddler and continuing to this day. Much of this money came to Mr. Trump because he helped his parents dodge taxes. He and his siblings set up a sham corporation to disguise millions of dollars in gifts from their parents, records and interviews show. When asked today about that report, Trump said the money he received from his father has, quote, been very well documented. Joining us now is Ross Buettner, one of the investigative reporters who worked exhaustively on that story and is featured in the Showtime documentary last night. Take me through how this story, this unbelievable body of reporting. Matt Miller and I were on set waiting to go on at 4. You dropped it at 3:10, which barely gave us enough time to read the 38 pages before we came on the air, but we did. How that dropped in the middle of the Kavanaugh inferno. It seemed like the kind of story that could have fueled a week-long conversation about how one of the central pillars of Donald Trump's identity was a big fat lie.
You mean, why didn't we try to wait for the perfect news day to publish the story?
Not the perfect news day, because I understand that when something's ready, there are editorial decisions and judgments made in holding it. But certainly last week was an extraordinary week in American politics.
Yeah, it did feel like an extraordinary week. We had been close to finishing this up for several weeks. We thought we were about ready before the hurricane struck. You may remember that.
Yeah.
But we hadn't quite closed the loop with the Trumps yet. We thought we were about ready as the Kavanaugh hearings appeared to be wrapping up before Jeff Flake kind of dropped a bomb and moved that on. And then it seemed like we had a quiet time. And as you know, it's really hard to suss out like when there's going to be a relatively quiet period of a few days. We didn't really know where the Kavanaugh process was going to go.
No,
so this didn't look like the best day we could find.
And I understand that once you've gone to all of your sources, the people you're covering for comment, there's always the risk that they'll try to blow it up on Fox News or something like that. Fair enough. I want to show you something from the documentary that brought to life what was hard for, I think, people that aren't expert in taxes to understand from the piece. Let me play it, and I want to ask you about it on the other side.
In August 1992, they set up a company called All County.
All County was this company owned by the Trump children, including Donald. And the stated purpose was it was going to be like this central purchasing agent for all the stuff that Fred needed to do to fix up his buildings. So if they needed a new boiler, right, All County would go out, take advantage of the economies of scale. Fred Trump would benefit because he'd get a lower price. But then we realized that All County, owned by the Trump children, was paying for boilers, and then they were charging Fred for the very same boilers this big markup. They were padding the invoices. They would buy a boiler for $10,000, and they'd turn around and they'd sell it to Fred for $15,000. And that's when you start realizing, oh, wait a minute. They're using All County to disguise cash gifts from Fred Trump as if they're legitimate business transactions.
It was an extraordinary illustration of the kinds of corrupt practices or fraudulent tax practices that your piece detailed. Can you talk about its significance?
Well, its significance is sort of in the kind of grubby nature of the whole thing. This is the President of the United States, a man who's presented himself as a billionaire, a master of high finance, and this was more like something you'd see on an episode of The Sopranos. It's a very simple little scheme where you're just padding an invoice and they're providing no service for it at all. But it has potentially more ramifications than that because there are tax implications. They were in essence dodging a gift tax. that could still be clawed back by the IRS or New York authorities. And then they were also passing along those inflated invoices to their tenants and applying for rent regulation, or I'm sorry, rent-regulated rent increases based on those invoices. And that could result in some kind of action too. Those tenants were in essence paying more for all these years than they really should have.
So you talked about The Sopranos. When Jim Comey wrote a book, he talked about his first meeting with Donald Trump, all the talk about the family, that it had this very mob-like feeling. In the documentary last night, one of your colleagues talked about investigative financial journalism. Was doing this work, was doing this investigation, was it more similar to uncovering financial crimes, or was it more similar to political investigative journalistic work? What was this story like? You guys covered this. Took you 18 months of records and documents and knocking on doors. You have some icy roads, streets that you pound in the piece, which is great. Just talk about what it was like covering the Trump family finances.
Yeah, it wasn't like a political story at all, really, because this is an era of Donald Trump's life and the Trump family's life where they had no involvement in politics. That really came much later than this. And this was a very, what's unique about trying to write about private, closely held businesses is how little is publicly available there. You know, you cover a corporation, they have a regular duty to report things to their shareholders. There's a substantial public record. But this was really trying to crack into a very closely held corporation or set of corporations that had never really had any public exposure to anything. So trying to find people who had been in and around that empire was a great challenge, and then getting them to talk, and then getting records that had never been public before. That was the real heavy lift. And then once we had all that, it was this kind of colossal forensic analysis of just hundreds of tax documents and ledgers, and you know, I read a book on real estate accounting twice over the last year and a half, and I didn't really see that coming either. Thank you.
Russ, I want to bring your colleague Jim Rutenberg into the conversation. This seems like the kind of piece of journalism that knocks down the claim about fake news. These weren't political players. They don't quote partisan senators or House members. This is almost like when people talk about the Mueller indictments being paper indictments. This was a paper case. This seemed indisputable. Donald Trump didn't even really push back hard. He simply called it boring. What do you make of the state of a piece like this with very little substance to punch holes in, but the White House trying to just avoid it by calling it long and boring?
Well, we've seen them do that a lot. But in fact, we talked about whether this was a political story or a financial investigative story, and it was definitely the latter. But it is the ultimate in political reporting, because political reporting is about puncturing the sort of the facade that all politicians put up. And this is the ultimate facade. And this one lasts decades. But, you know, it came out in a climate where it's very hard for anything to break through. And if you think that there's a perfect time to publish this piece in this news environment, I've got a boiler that I will sell you for $15,000
hey,
that I originally paid $10,000 for.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.